Good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and thank you for joining us for this next session of the Future of Cities Summit, hosted by my newspaper, The Globe and Mail, and by Tortoise Media. My name is Oliver Moore. I write for The Globe on urban issues, urban affairs, includes a lot of transportation, a lot of urban mobility, and I'm very glad to be here today as your chair, or perhaps ringmaster might be the better expression for what we're doing here. We're here to discuss urban mobility, how it's changed throughout this pandemic, how it's likely to change in the future, what that means for livability of cities, what that means for sustainability of cities. I'm very glad you're all here. It's a super important topic. You remember what Patricia Espinosa said, that the climate battle will be won or lost in cities. And on frankly, a more immediate, more quotidian level, without good urban mobility, cities grind to a halt. We can't live in cities without good transportation. For those who have watched the previous sessions, you can tune me out very slightly for a couple of seconds. I'm just going to explain to newcomers how this works. This is not your normal panel discussion. In essence, the difference is we're going to try and bring in the audience as much as possible. And I don't mean bring in to ask questions of our panelists. I mean bring in so we can hear what you have to say. We want to hear your contributions. Be aware that there are many, many people on this call. 530 it looks like right now. We will not be able to hear from everybody, so please, I beg of you, your patience. If you would like to speak, you can use the raise your hand function, or frankly, better, use the chat function so that we can have a bit of a sense of what you would like to say. Everybody by joining this call is muted and will remain muted until or if they are chosen to speak. If you are chosen to speak, I would ask you, please try to be a little bit concise. There are many people who would like to speak. We have only 45 minutes. And also remember that you are speaking to an audience that includes both experts and generalists. So keep your comments such that they speak to everybody. And finally, one last point, you are being recorded and parts of this may be shared on various digital platforms. So as I said, I'm very happy to be here today. We have three excellent speakers lined up. I won't give you full bios because you know who these people are. They are why you are watching today. But we have Andrew Carter, who's Chief Executive of the Center for Cities, the urban policy think tank. We have Barbara Gray, the General Manager of Transportation Services in the City of Toronto. And we have Alex Williams, the Director of City Planning for Transport for London. We also have in the background, and possibly playing the most important role today, is Tortoise reporter Ella Hill, who is managing the chat function. That's enough from me. We'll get straight into it. And I wanted to start with Andrew, because I think this question of urban mobility is super important. Like many people, I am no longer working in the office. Keen observers will notice the refrigerator behind me. We are all joining from various places. I suspect very few of us are in the office. Things have changed, but it's unclear how permanent these changes are. And I think we've all seen a lot of articles about how cities are ending, how people are leaving cities. These articles tend to be long on anecdote and short on actual data, but there's a lot of articles like that. And I think we have to discuss the future of cities before we can discuss the future of urban transportation. I think everyone in this audience, everyone on this panel is probably bullish on cities, but speak to the skeptic, Andrew. How do you make the case for the fact that cities will continue to prosper, will continue to thrive? There will not be a flight from density, and that cities are going to be places people want to live in close quarters for the future?
That's a great question. And you're right, there's been lots of debate. So I suppose my starting point, Oliver, would be, well, I think history is on my side, right? In a sense, we've had cities for the best part of 6,000 years, and, individual cities have waxed and individual cities have waned. But in a sense, the city remains dominant, the dominant form for civilization, as I say, over the last 6,000 years. So history is on my side. So I think that's a good thing. But to bring it up to date, I suppose, so kind of my other observation, and here I'm probably going to be wrong, but I'll make this observation nevertheless. I'm increasingly of the view that the impact of the pandemic on our cities is going to be short term. I think within the next 3 to 5 years at the max, essentially we'll be back to pre-pandemic levels. And I think there, because the centripetal forces, the attractors of cities will significantly outweigh the kind of centrifugal forces, I suppose. And I think that applies whether we are looking at from a work perspective or from a live perspective, or indeed from a play perspective. We'll have we'll have noise and movement over the next few years, but actually when we take stock in 3 to 5, I think cities in general will be back to where they are. However, and I think this is another important point, which does touch on the mobility question, I think there's going to be quite a lot of movement and shifting around over the next 3 to 5 years. I think lots of firms, lots of individuals, and indeed lots of policymakers are going to overshoot in their response. I think they're going to overshoot in their concerns about what they think is happening, and then they'll make decisions. And I think, as I said, that applies to individuals, it applies to workers, and it applies to policy makers as well. And then we, in part, the next phase will be having to recover from and deal with that overshooting. And I think that's an important point. And you can see how that's already playing out in urban mobility, where essentially we've had 2 decades of trying to encourage people out of their cars, and we've had 6 months of encouraging people back into their cars, right? That's a kind of classic short-run response driven by short-run effects that actually now we're going to spend the next probably 10 years unpacking and unpicking. And my final point, because I think this is, I've talked in aggregate, cities will survive and thrive. I've said this. I think, in cities in general will survive, but not every city. And I think, what we've seen pre-pandemic for the last 10, 20 years, depending on where you are in the world, is like the pattern of the, winner takes all urbanism, as it's been called, or the rise of the superstar cities. I see that continuing, in a sense of whether it's Toronto or New York or London or Paris or Seoul or Shanghai, they strengthen their position within their kind of national urban systems and indeed within the global urban system. But that's a different proposition, a different future to some of our coastal or peripheral cities, some of our post or pre-industrial industrial cities. I think they're going to have a much tougher time. And there's a question there about, what the future for them kind of looks like. And so my very final reflection is, to finish with a quote, and this is from Mike Batty, who's an eminent scholar and professor at the University College of London. Mike says, "We can't predict the future of cities, but we can invent them." And I think that's an important point, that we don't exactly know what our city is going to look like in 3, 5, 10, 15, certainly 20 years' time. But the decisions we make today have long run effects, and we need to be very mindful about the decisions that we make today. Unless, in some respects, we don't need to, or we shouldn't rush into immediate responses without fully understanding what's going on. Back to you.
Yeah, I think the historical sweep of your response is very important. I think, a few weeks ago, I was working on a story, and 2 different people I interviewed independently and separately raised the Spanish flu and the recovery from the Spanish flu as an example of how cities will come back. I mean, historical parallels are never exact, but I think that's interesting. And of course, we also should remember that if you look at, say, US data right now, it's places like South Dakota and Wyoming that are being hit by far the hardest by COVID. I mean, to the extent that this is a city plague issue where it was somewhat initially portrayed, I think that's less and less supported by the evidence. I'd like to go to you now, Barbara, because let's say that people do stay in cities. People still want to live in cities. They want to move around cities. I was out this morning at what we used to call rush hour, and I thought it still feels like rush hour. There's just as many people driving around as there ever were. To what extent would you say we're 8, 10 months in, depending on which city you were talking about, if cities have not made a meaningful shift now in their mode share, has that window closed?
I don't think that window has closed. And I was out yesterday as well. We were launching a couple new programs downtown, and the peak hour in Toronto, anyway, the peak hour in the morning anyway is not really a thing anymore. There's still traffic for sure, but that sort of very compressed, very high volume of traffic peak in Toronto has really spread out. And we've been collecting data on that since the beginning of the pandemic. For the afternoon peak, you're right, it's almost at 80% of normal levels. And so there's been a fair amount of shifting around. And what we have adopted as our practice, and I think we've seen it play out in cities across the globe, is adaptability. So we have to be adaptable in being able to manage the changing transitions of traffic, people's thinking and comfort level in getting back to riding transit again. I mean, for all of the cities that were just mentioned, transit is a critical component of being able to manage such huge volumes of people And I think we're also seeing, as people move more to work at home or stay at home for a longer period of time than they anticipated, that the way that the travel patterns play out over the course of the day has changed dramatically. So in inter-neighborhood travel has become critical and important, and some of those trips under 5 kilometers, which are really easily managed through cycling, and in some cases through walking, we really have to emphasize. We've been trying to work on making sure that there are choices and alternatives to car travel and also to transit travel. So that's why we've done a pretty significant expansion of our cycling network here in Toronto this year. But I think we're going to see some variability over time. I think there's going to be times when various cities go into a more of a lockdown mode where the travel patterns are going to shift. And then things will open back up again. And as I think we see the advent of vaccines, et cetera, we're going to see some things return to normal. But I ask the question of myself frequently and of my staff, which is, do we really, we're going to see growth in cities, that's the hope, but why should we have to go back to the same kind of congestion patterns? Like for Toronto, for example, we do not have a very robust transportation demand management program in trying to really focus and work collaboratively with large employers on shifting time of day travel, and really giving more incentives to telework, et cetera. Other cities have those programs, we don't. And so this is an opportune time for us to be able to roll that forward and try to get more of spread out over the time frame so that of the day, so that we can actually manage the congestion and not have it be as crippling as I think it was before we went into the pandemic.
That's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of people can get stuck with the idea that if it doesn't go back to the way it was before, it somehow has failed. If the road is not completely congested, it somehow has failed. If the subway train is not, cheek by jowl, somehow we've botched this, which I think is probably a good time to bring in Alex with the London perspective. I've been on a lot of tube trains in London, and they're pretty bloody full sometimes. And if that's the sign of success, maybe it doesn't get back to that. But I think that transit has to resume its place as a fundamental part of the transportation network. And the question then is, how does a city do that? I mean, you and I spoke a few weeks ago, and I think what you said was about 30%, that the tube tube ridership was about 30% of pre-pandemic normal, but that 2/3 of residents had ridden the tube in the previous month. So it's not just that people are avoiding it, perhaps that people are using it less. How does the tube or any transit or transport, if you're in the UK system, has it become that fundamental spine of urban transport again at a time when people may rationally or irrationally be afraid of being on transit?
Well, I think you're right. That is the pattern in London, where we've seen at the height of the pandemic, the tube ridership went down around 5% of norm. So normally you carry on 4 million people a day, and we were carrying 200,000 people a day. So really, really rock bottom levels, and we recovered to 30%. But we do have this interesting situation where ridership is around 20 to 30%. It's around 20% now because we're in lockdown 2 in the UK. But we did have that. The people, around 2/3 had used it in the last month. And I think what they've seen when they've used it is a very frequent service. We're running trains every 2 minutes on the tube, things like that. You're seeing a very clean service in terms of we're putting kind of hospital grade cleaning equipment there and putting a lot of effort into cleaning. You're seeing a service that isn't crowded. There is, you'll get a seat in a rush hour, and that compares with pre-pandemic levels of 5 or 6 people per square metre. And that was the norm that we would have coming into central London. So I think the reality is, successful cities rely on brilliant mass transit systems. They don't have that. They'll have a car-led city, and the car-led cities are not successful cities. So you need to get people back to trust mass transit, and that's our key activity. Really, is to emphasise it's safe in terms of it's clean and frequent, and people are wearing face coverings as well. So it's about building that confidence for them to come back. But I also think it's right to highlight that post-pandemic, people are not going to go back to the 5 or 6 people per square metre anytime soon. People are one of the key outputs of the pandemic is that people are travelling less by any mode, by plane, by road, by bus, and I think that reduction in travel, from a transport planning perspective, that's actually quite a good thing. We try to design cities so people don't have to travel as much, so you reduce emissions, but it feels as though the long-term trend of that 5-day-a-week commute, that will reduce, and you'll get a more of a mixed economy with people choosing to work from home, and that has a different issue. It has an impact on cities, both positive and negative. The negative is the central business districts at the heart struggle because so much of their economy is about the huge numbers that would go into there every day. The benefit, though, is the outer London economies, where more people are working and dwelling and socialising, are actually seeing quite a renaissance, actually, and seeing actually more activity going forward, really. So we call it this kind of low carbon localism, whereby people live and work locally. And there's a positive to that. The risk with it, though, is that kind of local living leads to more car trips. And one of, I think, the risks that we've got in London, and I'm sure we've got with many other cities, is this car-led recovery, as people, for those 6 months that Andy referred to about being told not to use public transport, use a car, whether that becomes a longer-term trend that we have to manage. But the first activity we have to do is to address that perception of safety. They will not come back if they don't feel safe. So you have to deal with that first, which is what we're doing in terms of cleanliness, in terms of frequency, and actually highlighting the research as well. The research is saying you don't get COVID on the tube network. There's no signs of it on our network at all, really. So I think those are the kind of fundamentals we have to deal with to get people back on our network post-pandemic.
You make an interesting point about the lack of crowding, and frankly, it's a much more pleasant transit experience. It's also a more financially difficult transit experience. Without a fundamentally different funding model, can mass transit systems be at 50, 60, 70% capacity, or do they frankly need to have that enormous crush of people a few times a day just to make them, not make money in most cases, just lose less money?
Absolutely. Our business model is broken. Absolutely. We're a mass transit system without state subsidy. So 72% of our income comes from the fares box. Most metros around the world are operating around 40% from their fare box. But metros across the world, their business model is broken at the moment with that low level of patronage. So as it currently stands, we can only survive with state support. And that's what we've got for this financial year, and we'll have to run into that into next financial year. But you're dead right, with that kind of low level of patronage, if that becomes a long term, you've got two options. You either reduce your service levels and cut your cloth to fit to reflect the level of patronage you've got now, or you look at other income streams, and that's either through increased fares or other fare sources, or some form of road user charging. All really difficult choices to make, really. So I think we're in a bit of an odd stage, really, where people get that the current business model is broken and you need state support. The state wants to wean us off that as quickly as possible, but they also want us to run maximum services. So we can't square that circle at the moment, but at some stage, we have to have a look at a kind of credible long-term funding settlement to get us through this, because otherwise, you will cut services or put fares up, and both are unpalatable as it currently stands.
I think now, if we could, I'd like to bring in Michael Rochlau, one of the audience members, who I think has an interesting point about how transit speaks a little bit to the silver lining advantage here. It's maybe not financially sustainable to have transit operating with fewer people, but there's an advantage to the individual passenger. And in the same way that smoothing out the ridership so that you don't have the enormous peaks that can be smoothed out a little bit. I don't know if we can bring Michael in directly, but I'd like to have him elaborate a little bit on that point, because there is some interesting advantages to transit as well and how people are using the system.
Completely, I agree. We haven't had a morning peak since March, and I think what our advice to businesses as they reopen out of lockdown was to take advantage of the opportunity to retime. So if we were maintaining social distancing on the tube and the bus network, we were saying actually, start later and finish later as well. Because what we found is that whilst people were starting later, say 11 o'clock, they were all finishing around 5, and that was creating a problem at that time. So, we completely buy into that kind of travel demand management and shifting the times of usage on the network. And I think you'll find that when people come back to the offices, they may well choose, rather than coming in the kind of traditional 9 to 5 commute, they may well choose to come in for a meeting at a certain time and come in for that, socialise and mix with their other colleagues, and then go back and then work from home for that time. So I think you're going to see different travel behaviours post-pandemic, definitely.
I think now perhaps we should go to Barbara, because I wanted to talk a little bit about some other ways of using the road. I mean, transit in any major city, transit is always going to be the spine of the transportation system. But there's other things as well, and the different ways you use the road. You talked about the cycling network that has increased in Toronto. Some cities have done huge advances in cycling in this year, but it's always a bit of a struggle. Even with a pandemic going on, it's a bit of a struggle. How do you make these interventions? How do you find ways to get the road to be used in a different way? Is it better to have a pilot project that in the end everyone knows in their heart will probably become permanent? Or is it better simply to make the change and let people get used to it? And if there's a real pushback, you go back, but you kind of know you're not going to go back.
Well, I don't think you can assume an outcome there, Oliver. I mean, I think that in Toronto hasn't yet met a pilot that it isn't willing to test, kick the tires on, as it were. So I think for Toronto and probably for many other cities as well, the ability to do some advanced work and then to implement something relatively quick and then to collect data to demonstrate that it's working. And that's been the major piece, is to try to get rid of the hearsay and narrative that is not supported by actual data. Is travel time actually being impacted when you take a lane away? There's lots of things that we can do to manage capacity through intersections. There's lots of things that we can do to ensure that the network is working more effectively, which implies that if you take away or shift a lane from general auto traffic to something else, doesn't necessarily imply that the network's going to grind to a halt. And I think that's a difficult thing for people to wrap their brains around, because they think if you have 6 lanes and you go to 4 lanes, you've immediately seen a reduction in capacity, and that is not accurate. So I also think that what the pandemic has done, and the need to support all sectors of our economy, including the small scale business economy on our main streets, has given people a little more courage to allow things to be tested and tried. And I think it's going to be very interesting. And we're going to be doing, we've done a pretty good data analysis of how our cafe program has worked this summer. There's going to be lots of interest in saying, if you did it then, why can't you just do it in the future as well? And so we're going to be coming back to our city council with a report on an ongoing proposal to retain some of the things that were really good about pandemic travel in the city of Toronto. And I know, reaching out to my network in the States, there's a lot of people there who have also changed and modified the way people use the existing roadways to really support physical distancing, pedestrian access, cycling, either for recreation or just to get to where you need to go, queuing outside of a business where you may not be able to go in the same way that you used to be able to, and being able to convert the right of way to meet those very immediate demands. Some of those things we should retain. And I think it's really, I feel very lucky that we actually have the data analytics to be able to look at the before and after and make some judgments about that are backed up by information, and then take that back out to the community to demonstrate that the world didn't end if we converted a curb lane parking space to a cafe.
Maybe the world will end next time. One never really knows. Let's actually bring in Anthony Gordon, if we could, from the chat. I thought that was a really interesting point Anthony was making about cycling infrastructure, because one thing that happens in Canada, and certainly in Toronto and a lot of North American cities, is people say, sure, cycling is all nice and great for 4 months or 6 months or 8 months of the year, but you can't do it all year round. It's not a real solution. If we can get Anthony on to talk a little bit about how cycling is actually more of a year-round solution than maybe people think, particularly if the infrastructure is there to support it. Anthony?
Yes, I was just trying to make the point really that clothing is one issue for cycling. There were comments about cycling in the winter. Yeah, it's not so nice, but people in other countries do. You go to Amsterdam, you go to Norway, people are cycling in the winter. They even get ice tires in some of the more northerly latitudes so they can still cycle on snow and so on. But I think a lot of the problem with cycling in cities as well is that the actual road infrastructure is rubbish in many places, especially when there aren't separate cycle lanes. And far too many of us have cycled along through potholed and depressed bits of road where the water splashes up, and then along comes a car and whoosh, you're soaked. That's about all I was going to say on that.
Okay. Interesting point, because it suggests, obviously it speaks to the fact that, you know, as someone who wants to ride a bicycle, it's up to you to some extent to dress for the weather, but it's also up to the city to provide the conditions that stop you from, you know, having the puddle hit you. And you see that as a pedestrian too. If you have large puddles of slush beside the sidewalk, beside the pavements, that's not very pedestrian friendly. Let's go to Andrew now on this topic of changing road use, changing how street space, how public space is used. There's been a lot of examples I've seen from different parts of the world, and it's not always clear what was actually pandemic related and what was happening already and has been kind of rebranded as pandemic related. Could you talk a little bit about cities that are doing a really good job of repurposing their public space, repurposing their roads, not to take them away from cars, but to find more efficient or more effective uses for them?
Yeah, I mean, these are my sort of impressions. People on the call, I mean, will know more about them in detail. But in the UK, you know, we've got some good examples that predate the pandemic, but have been given a shot in the arm through the pandemic in places like the actual city of London. So the square mile of London, you know, has aspiration to go car free. It's now closed off a lot of through roads and really taken a step in the direction of that. You know, a very historical city in the north of the country, in York, has advocated for a car-free area, and I think in the next 2 to 3 years they're going to make that reality. Again, they're dealing with congestion in medieval streets, so it's a good thing for them to be doing anyway. But they've been doing that. You know, Greater Manchester, you know, is catching up, I suppose, on cycle infrastructure, being driven by Chris Boardman, the Olympic cyclist, try to add much more infrastructure. This Anthony's point about, as well as the clothing and the bikes and all that, you actually have to provide relatively safe infrastructure to encourage. And more broadly, I think, you know, you see this in places like, you know, Paris, obviously, you know, burnt by some of the strikes and some of the issues last year, have gone big on cycling and the 15-minute city. Milan has been banning cars, I think, and Oslo has gone car free already. So I think in some respects, as Alex was saying, you know, this is a kind of longer run ambition of cities, or some cities at least, not every city, and they're using the pandemic really to both, you know, think about that modal shift question and repurpose their cities, because an awful lot of city space is given over to car parking and to road space, and we'll need to take some of that away if we want to achieve what we want to achieve. My final point, I would say, if you don't mind, this is a UK point of view, but I'm sure it applies to everywhere else. When we talk about the significance of public transport, we do really need to remember that once we get outside some of the bigger places, you know, Greater Manchester or Leeds or Bristol, the vast majority of journeys, whether they're to work or for other reasons, are done by car. You know, there isn't any public sector infrastructure in terms of buses or trams or rail that really provides an alternative. So there's a complementary significant investment that we're going to need to make in public transport outside of our bigger cities if we want to see some of the modal shift ambitions that have often been expressed.
You know, I think that's a really important point, because I think there are many circumstances in which driving a car is simply the most obvious and often the only choice. And I think urbanists and urban discussions can ignore that or not recognize that. And I think also there could be an argument to be made that in some cases now, during a pandemic, a respiratory pandemic, driving might be the reasonable or rational choice. And it's not to sort of hector people into not doing it, but to give them that option so they don't need to do it. I wonder if we could bring in Elizabeth Kelly from the audience, because one of the things that I think is interesting is a lot of the interventions that people are doing in their cities is partly about making the city livable now. It's partly about offering safe transportation options now. But in many cases, it's also about building for the future, about resilience, about making the city more able to cope with some future pandemic, some future problem. I think on the chat, you had something to say about that. I want you to, if you join us, Elizabeth, and share that with the broader audience.
Sure. Well, it was just a thought I was thinking about, because we're all talking about it's going to take 3 to 5 years to recover from this pandemic. But, COVID-19, it's not the only, virus that's going to come along. And so I think perhaps there will be, individual behavior change where I think we'll all be a lot more used to wearing masks. I remember I live in London. I remember being surprised about seeing a lot of people from Southeast Asia wearing masks on our tube, maybe 3-5 years ago, but they had survived SARS, and other diseases there. So obviously individual behavior will change. But I mean, given that this one, virus has ground us to a halt now, how can we prepare and make sure that our our cities and our urban transport can be ready? What fundamentally is going to have to change to just to make that not happen? Though I am happy to hear Alex Williams saying that there's very low COVID transmission on the tubes, but we all know we caught flu on the tube, going to Christmas parties every December. So if we ever get back to that sort of packing in, I think that's going to be a real issue.
I think the question of the sort of preparing for the next one, whatever the next one might be, is crucial, though I will give a little bit of slack to cities that are, I think in many cases, staff are running off their feet trying to deal with the current situation. And so it's very hard for them to prepare for the next situation. But it's possible that some of what is being done to sort of future-proof, or so to prepare to deal with this thing is in effect future-proofing cities and city systems for what might come along. One things that, so let's take a very long-range view, and I'm not sure who best to speak to this. Perhaps Barbara. Often when alternative transportation is discussed, people say, sure, that's lovely if you're in Amsterdam, but we're not Amsterdam. So on this topic of preparing for the future while also trying to handle the immediate, how do you bring into play sort of long-term shifts that help change the city in a fundamental way? So, Amsterdam 40 years ago was a very different place than it is now. How do you bring about those shifts, those long, gradual chipping away at shifts in the way that they are sold politically today, but ultimately have a 40-year horizon, even though everyone who's doing them now will be long gone 40 years from now?
Well, again, I think, Oliver, it's got to be about adaptability. And there's been some really interesting things that have come up in the chat about, it's not just one mode versus another. We need to give people the opportunity to pick they should have access to the modes that make the most sense for them for their journey on that day. And that's, from an operational perspective for a city agency, some of that gets really into the weeds about like, how do you clear the snow in bike lanes in Toronto in the middle of February consistently so that you're not pushing things around and making it a problem for pedestrians or for drivers or for cyclists or for business owners. And so sometimes you have to be able to stand up a system that might cost a little bit more now, but is ultimately going to give you a more reliable output. In terms of clearing that snow, because we get a lot more snow. I mean, there's lots of northern cities, we get a lot of snow, but I think if people want to cycle all winter long, I fully concur. It's about good clothing, and then it's about good maintenance of the public infrastructure. And the more we build, the more costly it is to maintain it. But that's what we have to get into place. And then I also think that the adaptability piece needs to be built into investments that we're making today. So we're upgrading a signal system today that's maybe 20 or 30 years old. We're moving to an adaptive model. Other cities have done this already. That gives us the ability to navigate congestion through differing circumstances. So surges in some times of the day versus being quiet in other times of the day, but that the signals can adapt to be able to manage the transit flows, the pedestrian access through intersections. And I think we can get prepared and phase things in over time. The other thing we're talking about right now is surface transit investments. So improving surface transit in our bus system on the street can be a faster, more reliable way to get better service for transit riders, or more reliable service, or certainly less crowding in situations where we can get more buses on those routes. It's still a complete streets question of transforming lanes from general purpose traffic to dedicated lanes. That's still a difficult conversation, especially in the suburban communities. And so I think the way that we roll that forward, perhaps with a phased approach in some places where we're really getting pushback versus being able to move quickly in places where we have the support, is the approach that we're taking right now. And I think that does help to future-proof our cities, because again, it's giving people options. If the subway's not working, can they take a bus? Can they take a bike for that trip? Or if they have to drive for that trip, is that going to be relatively reliable for them as well?
Thanks. I thought maybe we could bring in Peter Whitelaw, who was talking on the chat about driverless vehicles and microtrans. On this idea of options, I will say that I feel that 5 years ago, I was hearing much more bullishness on driverless vehicles than I'm hearing now, though obviously progress is being made in that direction. So I wonder, Peter, if you could talk a little bit about the role as you see it of driverless vehicles or microtransit and how that fits into these questions today. I'm not sure, it doesn't look like we have Peter on the line yet. Okay, here we go. Peter, you're up.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my video dropped just as you were introducing the idea of having me on. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about this. I'm intrigued by this idea that the business case for mass transit is broken. I'm not sure I agree with that, but nonetheless, it is a situation where you have a lot of people in a single vehicle packed in quite closely, and it has a limited flexibility with set routes and so on. In many places around the world, they use microtransit services to complement or replace mass transit, smaller vehicles with fewer people in them and often more flexible routes. And this, along with the idea of driverless cars or driverless vans, is interesting as a view perhaps into the future of a more flexible, adaptable transportation system that perhaps has a bit of a better business case. I'm really curious to hear what the professionals in the field have to say.
I actually would love to hear what Alex has to say on this. What I've heard from the past from transit agencies is that it can complement, but nothing on the surface could ever replace, a crush-loaded tube train. What do you think, Alex? Is it a complement? Is it a replacement, or is it a sideshow? You're muted, Alex.
So the question is about driverless cars, is it?
Driverless cars or microtransit. I mean, is it a complement to traditional transit, or is it a sideshow, or is it not even part of the discussion to your mind?
My personal view is it's a bit of a sideshow. I went in a driverless car 3 or 4 years ago, and you're right, there was a lot of emphasis that this was going to change the world. And whilst I think cars are becoming more automated and there are more automation features in them, particularly around safety measures, the fully automated driverless car is nowhere near being a kind of mass option, as far as I can tell. In terms of mass, in terms of micromobility, I think that is moving. If you think about the e-scooters and other kind of similar ventures, that does feel as though it's out there. And I think one of the challenges you've got is how the regulation for those new forms of mobility needs to catch up with those new new scooters and new forms of entry to the market. One of the challenges I think for this though is that I remember a couple of years ago we had all the dockless bikes coming into London, and they were going to change the world with a lot of venture capital, and we had literally thousands of bikes that arrived in the city overnight, and they were used as a kind of bit of a novelty, but frankly they weren't very good, and those business models failed. So they are being reassessed and coming back in. So I think with micromobility in particular, it's quite a dynamic market, and you get entrants in very quickly to try and get some market share, but they can go very soon after arriving if they're not working in the city, particularly if they're not good enough quality. It's quite interesting. During the pandemic in London, we've got a cycle hire scheme that the mayor introduced 10 years ago now, and that's the only mode that has seen an increase in usage in London during the pandemic. Every other mode has seen a reduction in usage, but Santander Cycle Hire has seen an increase at the heart of the city of London at a time when there's no international tourism. So it's quite interesting if you get a high quality facility that people want to use, and you put in the extra cycle lanes, which we have done. An extra 80 kilometres of segregated cycle lane have gone in during the pandemic. People will use it. I get that it's it may be a kind of fair weather change in behaviour, but certainly if you get the quality right, people will use it.
I think actually, if we could stick with you, Alex, there's just a follow-up, because I think it's interesting the emphasis Transport for London has put on cycling, even on walking. You look at some of the tube stations, and the maps will say, walk from this station to that station. Don't take the tube. Is there a fundamental tension between the desire to have people move as effectively and as efficiently as possible in the city, which is an individual benefit to those people and to the city, versus the tube that wants people to pay fares and ride the train and thus help, replenish the business model that you mentioned earlier? Or is it that those groups will never be large enough to undermine the business model, that they're important for the city, but they don't hurt TfL's coffers?
It's a really interesting question. It's worth noting in London, we're a city of 9 million people. Around 27 million trips a day are made in our city, and around a quarter are by foot. And that's great. London is a very walkable city. It's one of those superstar cities that I mentioned earlier, I think, really. And I think we want to create a safe and pleasant walking environment for people to do that. And I think that's particularly important for rail commuters coming into central London. And I think that's quite interesting that what we've had to do around some of the mainline stations is really improve the walking environment, because what people are choosing to do is come in on the mainline termini, but then walk their final journey through the centre of the city to their place of work, really. So the classic scene on London Bridge of people getting across that, but also all of the big bridges in London are really packed with walkers in the morning. And in central London, the dominant mode is actually by foot. And I think one of the issues that we should be looking at as a planner of a city is making sure there's appropriate space for pedestrians, and we don't, and just look at the kind of crowding issues on footways and deal with that, rather than just doing the traditional traffic modelling and saying, well, you can't slow down the traffic here. Actually look at the wider movement pattern of more people walking in central cities.
I think that's an excellent point. I think that I often think when I'm pondering these issues is an old quote. I can't remember who it was, some Hollywood celebrity from a few generations ago, who said, buy land, they're not making any more of it. And I sometimes think of that in the case of cities, that there's a set amount of land there, and we can use it in any number of ways. And we can say it is what it is because that was the way it was built 50 or 100 or 150 or 200 years ago. Or we can say that this is in flux. No one's going to knock down a building to make a bicycle lane, but that the public realm, the road space, is adaptable. It is not necessarily set in stone. So I wonder if we could go back to Andrew, and we started a bit of an existential note about the future of cities, and I wonder if we could finish on a bit of a philosophical note about who owns the public realm in cities. I don't mean in a legal sense, and not even really in a political sense, but in an urban sense. This space we're talking about, this is all of our space. It's been dedicated to driving for decades. How do you determine the metaphorical ownership of it? Is the street owned by the people who live next to it? Is the street owned by the people who drive over it to get to somewhere else? Is it a collective? I mean, it's a thorny issue, but finish it in 30 seconds if you could.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, in a sense, you're right. I mean, the very essence of of cities, in a sense, it's not the buildings or the infrastructure; it's the people. People make cities, and it's the real bringing together. It's the absence of space that defines cities over other things. I suppose just in reflection to there's an ownership question. I would say at the moment I think there's a payment question, right? And I think in cities, if drivers want to drive, and I'm not going to ban drivers from driving, I think they should pay closer to the full costs of the decisions that they make. When we think of their decision to drive in our cities has negative impacts often on others, whether it's through air quality, whether it's through congestion and lost productivity, or whether it's less space for other uses. And I don't think we are having a proper conversation in enough cities about how we expect our drivers to pay for that. So the system will vary in different places. We'll debate the the detail, but actually it's a universal issue and we should be doing that. And that's why we should be having congestion charging or road pricing in every city of a reasonable size. And then we can debate the variations around it. Otherwise, we're going to have a kind of one-half conversation, which is about how do we make public transport brilliant, but not really addressing the question about the costs incurred by those that choose to drive. So it's a payment problem, I think, in some respects, as much as an ownership problem.
I think that's a really interesting point, because certainly any reporter who's covered City Hall issues and has covered transportation issues has heard many times the notion that cyclists don't pay their way. There's often variations on that. We should license cyclists, we should charge cyclists, et cetera, et cetera. But then you see these statistics that for every kilometer someone drives, society pays X, and for every kilometer someone cycles, society saves Y. And once you see those numbers, it's pretty stark, and it speaks to your point. I think we are essentially out of time. And so I am going to stop us here and say thank you very much to our participants, both on the panel and virtually, everyone who's able to weigh in either directly or weigh in via the chat. I really appreciate that you joined us today. And also, of course, to the people behind the scenes who made this all possible and made us look good. The next session will continue in just a few minutes. It is City of Dreams, What is the Future of City Culture and Nightlife? With Tortoise editor Matt D'Ancona. That'll be in a few minutes. We'll be going dark until then. So if that session is something you're interested in, stay tuned. But thanks very much for joining us today.